It's now been exactly 1 month since the Minecraft movie's first trailer came out, and people honestly seem to have accepted it a bit more now.
What the hell?
Some people, at least. One positive everyone seems to agree on though is that the set design looks pretty cool. The world shown in the trailer looks great, especially this village shown at the start of the trailer, which is why I spent ages recreating it in Minecraft, to be as identical as possible. There's one pretty big issue though. It doesn't actually look very good in game. It looks good in the trailer with lots of extra lighting effects, but in game the walls are all flat, there's no texturing on the paths, the structures have no shape, and the terrain looks odd. Even though I kind of actually like the blocky terrain, to be fair. And so today I'm going to go back over everything and redo the entire build. I'll be updating absolutely everything, from structures to terrain to adding in new areas to explore that complement the build. I spent over 100 hours on this video, so please consider leaving a like and a comment as I love reading every single comment. Anyway, let's begin. To make this exciting, I'm going to be building directly on the original build rather than starting from scratch. That way, if you haven't watched the first video where I built this, you'll be able to see what each area looked like before. I would recommend watching that video before you continue this one though. Just make sure to come back again after, please. I started to ruin all of my previous progress by turning the terrain back to gold blocks, which is a placeholder that I can switch out later for other blocks. This just makes it easier to work with and shape. I decided to smooth out all of the corners of the terrain, turning it from looking cubic to instead looking like it's made out of boulders. I also edited the shape of the terrain a bit to have a more gradual hill downwards, so the arch would look less out of place. This also allowed me to raise up the left Cliffside Village a bit, meaning you'll get even better views of the entire village from there. To finish the terrain, I then painted it, and added a ton of rocks all over it. I gave the whole thing a very realistic stone grey palette, instead of the previous red palette. I wanted to keep the terrain the same colour scheme originally, but there just aren't many red coloured stones in the game, and so I couldn't add a nice gradient, which is pretty important to do. From here, I began the very time-consuming job of removing every single tree from the world. Before, we tried to replicate the trees from the film, and so the trees look a bit odd and very cubic. I'm probably going to use that word a lot to describe the old build throughout this video. I thought it'd make sense to just remove all of the trees now, so I can add back in more realistic trees later on. Talking about making new trees, I really tried to do my best with the designs. I created a ton of oak trees just like the original build had. Mixed into the branches are some spruce fences and gates, which I just used to help make the branches look more rugged and spread out. I also mixed some grass and ferns into the leaves, just to make them look more real, as well as some mushrooms into some of the trunks to add some colour. Once I'd made an absolute ton of oak tree designs, I decided to also make a handful of birch trees which we can scatter in some areas to add some variety. I won't be using many of these, mostly because I didn't really like how the designs ended up looking, but I did my best. For now though, I just focused on placing these trees all around the arch, with a couple being on top of it to really make it feel grown into the landscape. We'll add more trees around the world though as we go. With the main terrain done, I decided to start with the last structure that we actually built last time, which is the small sandstone fort on the side of a cliff. To start building it, I deleted it. Considering this fort is most likely here to defend the village, I thought it should be bigger as the original looked super small. I won't just be expanding the size of every build in this world to call it an upgrade, but I did think that this should be bigger. I tried to keep the original block palette and layout of the build, just on a bigger scale with a lot more details. There's also a second indoor level which can be used as a point for archers to defend the fort. For the tower on the side of the fort, I kept it the exact same look, with a pointed roof that's actually 1 block thick in the middle this time, so that I could add a pointy spire on top of it. Inspired by the original, I then added a couple of windows on the side of the tower which would be used as lookouts. These just helped to break up the design and add some more shaping, which I felt was needed. Finally, I moved on to the top level of the fort, and added back in the raised walkway that goes across the top, as well as the small farms on the back, which I decided to turn into planters this time as it made a lot more sense than having chickens on the top of the fort. I also added a staircase which leads to the higher walkway. Most importantly, I then added tons of details all around to add more life to the build, like barrels, chain armor, torches and hanging chains. I feel like these final touches are what was really missing from the original build. But with that, the fort was finished. I'm really happy with it and I think it's a great start to the village, but we've got a lot of structures to upgrade. The next area I decided to work on is the Cliffside Village that the fort overlooks. This area looks pretty different now that the terrain has been raised up so much. This house is the first of many that will be transforming. While the original build reused a lot of structures, I want to try to make almost all of them unique this time, with only a couple being reused. While the original designs aren't identical to the ones in the film, they were as close as you could get without using microblocks. I do kinda wish that they'd instead used more creative building methods to make the houses look good though, as it's possible to add more depth and details using blocks like stairs, fences and buttons. I also tried to add further detailing by using more heavily detailed blocks, like the back of looms and beehives. For these two matching farmhouses, I expanded the shape out to make them a bit more interesting, with a small storage shed on the side of each. As you'll notice, I'm really trying to keep the colour schemes of each house as much as possible, only mixing up a few small things to improve them. With the houses all updated, I then added in some new pathways along the Cliffside Village to connect all of the houses properly, and I then added a bunch of small farms in. The world in the movie had the kind of rectangular farms that you'd see in a naturally spawning village, but instead I wanted to try and actually blend the farms in with the landscape to make it more natural, and in my opinion, better looking. To complement the farms, I added in a couple of scarecrows made out of bamboo, which I really like the design of and use in a lot of my builds. I also added some other small details around the paths, like composters and benches. I don't know why I decided to leave this in the video, but I attempted to make a lamppost design to also have around the village. It looked absolutely awful and way too bulky, and instead of adding it, I decided to destroy it and not add any lampposts to this area. Finally, to tie it all together, I added some leaves around the paths and then spam trees all over the place, as I wanted the village to really feel hidden away on the side of the cliff, being quite cozy to explore. So that the village was actually accessible, I then built up a huge staircase which connects it to the lower path. I also added a raised pathway which comes off the side of this and connects it to the bigger central village that we'll work on later. This village is probably one of my favourites in the whole build, second maybe to the farming one which we'll build later. I'm really happy with how it came together, and the views that you get from it are amazing, and will look even better once the rest of the world is transformed. For now though, let's move on to the windmills, which is where we started last time. The first thing that I did with these is expand the base, making it circular and more bulky to help keep the windmills in the ground. I also switched the base to cobblestone, to add some variety to the block palette, as before the whole windmill was made out of sandstone. Going upwards, I then added a small balcony, which leads up to a tall tower. As you can see, I'm really trying to make the windmill look a lot more rustic than the original. Here I added a bunch of windows all along it so you can actually look out the windmill, before getting to the top. You'll notice that I really switched up the block palette here. However, I kept the top section sandstone so that it would actually feel similar enough to the original. For the blades of the windmill, I tried to make them look a lot more realistic, not just using fences to build them, but instead mixing in some wool and bone blocks to look like cloth. I did a small bit of landscaping work, and then added a wall along some of the terrain to break it up a bit, before marking out a bunch of pathways and then finally filling in the area with wheat. There wasn't originally a farm here, but I felt it would match the windmill, and also helps to blend the farms from the cliffside area into the rest of the world. Moving over to the other side of the pathway, I copied the windmill over and edited the roof, just like I did with the remake of the original build. I thought it would make sense to expand the wheat farm onto this side too, but with a larger variety of crops like potatoes and carrots. Before adding all of the crops though, I built a cobblestone platform under the houses to make a small plaza area around the windmill and the houses. For this area, I decided to switch one of the houses to instead be a barn, to be more fitting with the area. All around it, I added some hay bales, barrels and water cauldrons to add some life. I then turned the other house into a storage shed, with the main change once again being the roof, which I decided to make a lot flatter and switch to deep slate. And then to tie the area together, I created a small red tractor design. It doesn't look great, but I'm not very good at building vehicles, so at least you can somewhat tell that it's a tractor. I copied this design and pasted it all around the farm. We're making significant progress with the front area of the world, but there's still a lot of boring jobs to get done, like adjusting all of the pathways. I just went around all of them and added some leaves on either side of the paths, while also adjusting any areas with stairs to look more distinct from the rest of the pathway. Most importantly, I then textured the path with some tiles and packed mud to make them look more interesting and aged, before flooding the area with rocks, grass and trees. The next structure that I wanted to work on was this wishing well. I raised the platform up a couple of blocks to make it stand out more, before adding some extra details to the well itself, and a cauldron in the center that works as a bucket to collect water. Next to this, I then moved the small mob farm a few blocks over, and decided to transform it into an actual barn. It's not anything special, but it works as a great place to store horses, which you can ride to explore the world. Now from here, I still had a ton of houses to transform, and this isn't even the main village area. I just went around and did my best to add as much detail as possible, without making anything too detailed to the point of being messy. I think I managed to find a good balance. While these two farmhouses were originally copied over from the Cliffside Village, I wanted to instead do something unique with these two, and so I combined them both into one larger farmhouse. To make this farm area different from the others, I decided to turn it into an apple orchard, using a couple of invisible item frames to place apples on the trees and the ground, which is always a nice detail to add and helps to liven up the area. Following the terrain downwards, I replaced the few rectangular farms that go down the hill to instead be more blended in with the landscape, with a path on the side that leads you down to this larger house that sits alone on the right side of the map. This is probably the house I made the least changes to, as shaping already looks really nice on the default one. But I did add a large pathway that connects it to the ground level, so that it's easier to get up to. This wasn't a problem with the original build, but I moved the house up as I was editing the terrain. And the final area to transform in the front part of the world is the docks, and I had a lot of fun transforming them. I edited the terrain to be less cubic and covered it in lots of mossy rocks, also adding in patches of sand along the edges. I then added some basic details to the dock itself, adding in a bunch of barrels. As well as this, I added a crane onto the side of the docks, which can help transport cargo onto and off of ships. I kept the design pretty small and keeping with the area, but it looks nice. Another thing I switched up was this small house, which I just added slightly more details to before moving on to adding a couple of market stalls around the main area. That way people would be able to trade and sell goods that have been transported onto the island, as well as fish that any fishermen have managed to catch. Obviously though, in order to catch fish you need to have a ship, and so I decided to add a large boat onto the side of the docks, which has a large sail on the side and a small cabin at the back. Considering I don't build boats, I'm quite happy with it. I then pasted this design onto all of the edges around the island. Originally I was planning to add a lighthouse to this section next to the dock, but I felt it would ruin some of the sight lines and take away from the big central tower, and so I chose not to and just added some trees and rocks instead. And then I went back to updating a ton of houses. This time I was adding extra details to the ones that led up to the central village. There's this large structure which I also decided to turn into a large tavern. I moved the top section up a bit to make it grander, and then added a second story with large windows, and some beer barrels out the front of it to fit the theme. For the raised area next to it, I turned it into a small seating area for the tavern, so people could get a drink or some food and sit out there to admire the world. It looks pretty peaceful. This is the part I have been most excited for, but also the most nervous about, the main village. This sits directly under the arch and is where the majority of the population would live. I started by moving everything upwards to add some extra height, before building giant walls around the entire thing to keep any residents safe. I'm assuming the most important characters from the movie would live here, and so security is extra important to have. A lot of villagers would probably want to get in to visit Jack Black. As you'd probably expect, I then went on to update the houses. I tried to really work on making these houses seem grander than the previous ones, adding a lot of extra height to all of them. I did copy and paste a couple of designs, especially on this raised up area, as I wanted the houses to look identical like the original. I still don't know what this square structure is, which has an odd looking roof. I'm assuming it's some kind of library, but I updated it anyway. Adding all of these details to the houses in this area alone took me about 2 to 3 hours, but I'm glad I did it first as it helped me picture out how to adjust the rest of the village. With all of these houses done, I moved on to the church. The original looks like a church that you'd find in a default Minecraft village, but with some extra details. I decided that the best way to update it would be to demolish it and start fresh, as I wanted to really increase the scale of it. It felt odd having a church which is smaller than most of the houses, as churches are normally meant to be quite grand. Even with the bigger version though, I kept the same layout, with 3 wall sections on the side and giant windows, and then a square front section which includes a flat roof. I also added a giant cross to the front and some extra windows as well as a pathway that leads up to the entrance. As I made the church so big, it didn't actually fit onto the area that I'd marked out for the village, and so I just built a base for it to sit on. My favourite thing to upgrade in the village was this large tower. I still think it's some kind of prison tower because of the iron bar windows, and so I decided to really lean into that theme. For the base, I expanded parts of it outwards, with triangular supports on the bottom that spike out from it. At the top of the tower, I made it a bit taller, with a much cooler design at the top with 4 large rooms hanging off the side of it. These would be the most highly protected cells for the most dangerous prisoners, like people trying to grief the world. As they're right at the top of the tower, they'd be the hardest cells to escape from. The last housing structure I had to transform was this big town hall. It was really difficult to make it look good because of the big flat walls. However, I added some details and then some new windows coming out of the roof, just to break the design up a bit. Around the front, I added tons of details, and a bigger staircase that leads up to the front door, which I raised up a bit from where the original door was. Don't click off yet as there's still lots to do, but while I add some final details to this area, I just want to say that I'll be posting the world download for this build in my Discord if this video manages to reach 5,000 likes. You can also download the original remake of the world in my Discord. I'll leave a link to join in a pinned comment. And now is the most important part of the entire transformation, the strange stack of pink wool in the center of the village. Literally hundreds of people left comments letting me know that this is probably a cherry blossom tree, and so thank you to everyone for letting me know. I've never really built a cherry tree before, but I did my best and created this. If the movie comes out and this does actually turn out to be a stack of pink wool, I'm going to cry. To finish the village, I added some final touches like edits to the fountain to make it much more of a centerpiece. And as always, a couple of market stalls which sell cake, armor, and a couple of other things. Finally, I added in some bunting and benches on the raised area of the village. After many days of work, the area was completed. Because of the changes I made to the heights of things, you can get some amazing views of the village, and I'm really happy with how it came together. The whole place seems a lot more vibrant too, which is fitting for Minecraft. As you'll know from the last video though, we still have the back of the world to transform, which I'm going to speed through pretty fast so that I don't go insane. Just like last time, I started on the right side with a small house that's right next to a farm. After upgrading the house, I decided it would look much cooler to instead have the entire raised area covered in farms, as there's so much blank unused space on this side of the world. I surrounded the farm with logs to keep it all protected. Moving around to the connected farming village, I combined the 2 chicken pens into one, and upgraded it, even including a small chicken coop. It now looks a lot more realistic. As I work on upgrading this area, you'll notice me adding a bunch of flowers. I've been adding these all around the world to add more colour to the build. I'd assumed that the original build had flowers mixed in with the grass, but I couldn't see any in the images that I was basing it off, and so I left them out. Now though, I'm adding as many flowers as possible, with a huge variety of types, especially using alliums as they're my favourites. You can notice alliums in pretty much all of my builds. With the area all done, I surrounded it by rocks and trees, and then moved over to this other area connected where there's a small pumpkin farm and some crop farms. The spirit of October really got to me, and I decided to expand the pumpkin farm to be huge. I even made edits to the house next to it to turn it into a pumpkin cafe, where pumpkin pies are made and sold. There are also a few market stalls selling pumpkins outside, with some seats to sit on while you eat. I love this area and I don't even like pumpkin pie. I tried to mix things up for the next farms and I kept them rectangular, but just adjusted the leaves around them to make them look more bushy and natural. I also decided to change the animal pen at the back to once again include a barn for cover, so that the animals in it aren't left out in the rain. After adding many more rocks, I painted the terrain with some sandy edges, and then moved over to the main area for the back. This village section connects the main central village with a couple of smaller houses and farming areas. I just gave this area a pretty standard cleanup, with a few new buildings like a shed next to the animal pens. On top of this, I decided to raise up a platform for the houses that are directly next to the town hall, to cover up the really ugly blank cobblestone wall on the side of it. This also just helps to make the height transition smoother from the central village, so there's less of a sharp transition. Next to this area, I added a couple more market stalls with a couple of unique ones like a shop which sells flowers, which have been picked from all around the world. And now the final area is the left side. All of this was speculation on what could be in the area, as no images show what's actually over here. Because of this, the area just has a couple of houses and farms. I obviously upgraded these, but I also added in a small pink sheep statue in the center of a pathway, to pay respect to the OG pink sheep in the game. There's a small pathway which leads you down to two smaller houses that are tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and I decided to theme them a bit better to have more of a purpose. These are now where lumberjacks live, in charge of harvesting wood to build all of the houses. Finally, the last thing I wanted to add was something brand new. My friend, Clores, built a huge statue for me to add to the world, which pays respect to the original characters of the game. While I'm excited to see Jack Black play the role, I'd also love to see some references to the original Steve in the film, even if it's just a statue somewhere. But with that, we were finished. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed the video and liked the transformation. As I mentioned at the start, I spent a very long time on this video, so please consider leaving a like and subscribing, as I make giant builds all the time. I read every single comment, so make sure to tell me what you think of the build, or just leave a comment about literally anything as it helps boost the video too. I'll see you soon, goodbye.